You're listening to the expository preaching ministry of Kootenai Community Church, located in Kootenai, Idaho. We pray that Christ is exalted and your spirit is blessed by the teaching of God's Word. For more information about Kootenai Church, please visit us online at kootenaichurch.org.
This is a big stack of questions here. I think that of all the equipping conferences we've done, this is the biggest stack of questions that I've ever brought up on the stage during a Q&A. So some of you have asked the same or a similar question. So if you don't hear your question asked exactly as you phrased it, it's because I probably have taken it and tried to phrase it in such a way as to give it to Jeff so that it would cover multiple questions that were somewhat similar. All right, so here we go. First up, Pastor Jim, did you realize your fly was wide open during the introduction this morning? And yes, I did realize that, not till I sat down. And thank you, by the way, that it wasn't just down, it was open, and not just open, but wide open, apparently. I appreciate the use of adjectives there. That was very clever. All right, next up.
Is this being recorded?
It's being live streamed in front of tens and tens of people. All right, a couple of conspiracy theory type questions. What is your belief about people who claim to have been abducted into the secret space program? Is it delusional, mind control, deceiving to promote an agenda? They claim to have been transferred to a space colony on Mars where they communed with aliens. Some claim to have worked with the Satanist Michael Aquino. Wasn't Aquino a colonel in the military? He'd be a classmate of yours. Which branch? My daddy always told me that's not a stupid question if you really want to know.
Can you start again?
There's a lot there, I know.
Yeah. I would say that the author of that question has a great sense of humor.
Is there a secret space program?
Not that I know of, but if there is, it's secret, and I wasn't clued in on it.
So that brings up something that's not in the questions, but question I thought of earlier. This is not, you'll be able to answer this. The Space Force, Trump's Space Force. Is that a thing? Is it not a thing?
Of course it is.
Is it connected to NASA?
No. It's military. It's part of the DoD. It's actually a very parallel evolution, no pun intended using that word, in history, parallel to the Army Air Corps becoming the Air Force in 1949, I think. Anne Marie's dad was in the Army Air Corps World War II, and he always used to say, yeah, in the Air Force, I would tease him, you weren't in the Air Force, you were in the Army. But the Army Air Corps became the Air Force in 1949. The space assets, there were a lot of space things going on in the military, and probably the biggest portion of that was in the Air Force, but there was also an Army Space Command, and there was a Navy Space as well, and they consolidated much of that and made it the Space Force.
Okay, so no secret space program, no communing with aliens.
No.
Have you ever seen a UFO?
Yes, almost every day. I see it's an airliner, and I look up, and I can't tell if it's an Airbus or a Boeing.
Okay, what evidence is
Unless
there?
I pull out FlightAware and pull up, and I know exactly what it is.
What evidence is there that backs the moon landing?
That what?
That backs the moon landing. Give us the evidence for the moon landing.
The moon landings themselves, all of the people involved in it. I don't know exactly where it is, but you can go search the internet, find modern day surveillance of the lunar surface taken by a lunar orbiter. I forget the name of the satellite, but it's high definition imagery of the entire lunar surface, and you can see all of the lunar lander bases that were left there when the crew left the moon. Each crew left the moon. You can find them there. I know we're doing short answers, but you'll find this interesting. Neil Armstrong passed away, and I think it was 2017. Just a couple months before he passed away, he and I were both at a aerospace medical conference in Atlanta, Georgia, and he gave a presentation. I gave a separate presentation, but his was at a luncheon, and he showed the raw footage of his approach to land, he and Buzz Aldrin, to land, and in a parallel screen showed using the high definition imagery of the lunar surface, kind of a virtual approach or trajectory using that imagery, going down the same trajectory. So you saw the raw footage of his approach, and then you saw this VR using imagery, which is really clear. And the only difference between the two is as they approach the landing site, you see his lunar lander left there, and when they got close, you see a bunch of dust being blown up in the original. Of course, nothing in the right. But it was a fascinating presentation that he gave.
How long is the training to be able to go to space?
It depends, but I would say on the order of several years. I trained for about a year and a half for my first space shuttle flight, 10-day long flight. I trained for at least 3.5 years for the expeditionary flight, my first one, and then something less than that for the last 2 expeditionary flights. And the training was longest for the 2006 flight, that first expeditionary flight, because we were only a crew of 2, and both of us had to learn not only all of the NASA U.S. systems, but all of the Russian systems as well. So I spent half my life was in Russia. My commute was Houston-Moscow every 4 to 6 weeks, back and forth. We trained together there, came back, trained in Houston, went to Moscow. So you had to learn the language and had to learn all the Russian systems to include the Soyuz spacecraft that we launched on. And that just takes a long time. Nothing is really hard except the Russian language. But it's just the volume and the scope of things that we were exposed to that we had to train. All the operations, all of the things that could go wrong, which is a vast majority of the training. All the spacewalks, I did spacewalks in both the U.S. suits and the Russian suits. All of the science experiments. You can't call a plumber, so you have to train for those kinds of things. You can't call an electrician, you have to train for those kind of things. You can't go to the emergency room, so we get medical training as well. I spent many shifts after basic course in EMT kind of medical training, many shifts in the trauma center in Houston, which was really intriguing and kind of exciting. But you get to do just about anything that comes in the door as long as the doctor supervising is comfortable with you doing it. So that was great training as well. So just some examples. Which presidents addressed the Corps of Cadets during your time at USMA? Well, I didn't attend any graduation ceremony except my own, and we had the Secretary of Defense address us. Who was that? You put me on the spot. I can't remember. It was 1980. Anybody remember? Any of you history buffs? So Caspar Weinberger? No, he was under Reagan, right? So Carter was still president at the time. So actually, I was kind of happy that Carter didn't come give us a talk. I shouldn't say that. Who won the Army-Navy game your plebe year? Plebe year, actually, I told you earlier the Army did, we did, but I think it was my yearling year or sophomore year that we beat Navy. We only beat Navy once of the 4 years I was there. Do you have any glorious tales from personal spirit mission hijinks at the academy? I wasn't personally involved, at least that I recall. Mm-hmm. But plausible deniability. Yeah, we did steal the Navy's goat one year, and it appeared in the mess hall at West Point. How was the cow? Oh, that one, you prepared me for that one. Yeah. I get it right. I had no idea what any of these questions meant. Yeah. So this was a piece of trivia when you're a plebe at West Point. And where's the West Point graduate here? Oh, there he is back there. It's your question, I know, right? So there's trivia that you have to memorize when you're a plebe or a freshman at West Point. Any upperclassman can ask you at any time any of these questions. So when you got the question, how is the cow? The answer is, sir, she walks, she talks, she's full of chalk. The lactose fluid extracted from the female of the bovine species is highly prolific to the nth degree. That's the answer. I'm not going to read it again. For those of you that didn't catch it. Do you ever have conversations with or debate astronauts who are unsaved and do not see space through a biblical view? And if so, what proofs do you use? Well, ultimately, you can't prove it to bring somebody to faith, right? So you recognize that. All you can do is give witness. And just like our experience on Earth, it's no different. Still humans, a variety of humans, different backgrounds. With some individuals, you get opportunity for a conversation. I've been on board with a couple times with believers. We had great conversations. We pulled out the scripture and had shared an encouragement of that. Others, you have, like I said, varying degrees of opportunity in conversation to talk about the wonder of the view and to put it in the context of God's work of creation. And very seldom do you get a chance to actually get to the gospel. So just like here. And if you're talking one-on-one, generally for lots of people, you get some opportunity to go to some depth. But if there's another witness involved, you hardly go anywhere, right? Because everybody seems to be intimidated if there's another witness witnessing their conversation on things religious or whatnot. So it just like here, it varied.
They obviously are surrounded by the same awe and wonder and beauty that you see.
Yes.
How do they respond to that?
In the same way, to a point, right? It's amazing. It's beautiful. You want to attribute it to God. It's just itself. It's inherent in the matter itself. So they can't explain it beyond that. And we know very well as believers that even that did not bring us to faith. It may have been an instrument along the way to invoke our curiosity, to bring up questions or whatnot, but ultimately it is the work of the Spirit in our heart to open the eyes of our mind, to open our eyes, open our ears to hear the gospel and to accept it. It's a work of God. It's not our response to whatever we're viewing.
Okay, I think I captured that. There's a couple cards here that says there are no atheists in foxholes. So how do astronauts see the handiwork of God, and do they continue to trust in their own pagan worldview? I think we answered that question. Mm-hmm. Do you believe the dominion mandate of Genesis extends to space? If so, how far, and what biblical basis is there for this?
I think maybe implied in that question is the one verse that comes to mind is the heavens are the Lord's and the earth is reserved
belongs to man.
Belongs to man. And I've thought about that verse. I think that space exploration, as we know it and have experienced it, and are capable of executing it, is a component of the dominion mandate. And I've said that all weekend long. I could get technical, and if you want to argue with that verse that I referenced, I could say the earth is the earth system. We're still in the earth system technically. The earth is still our focal point. But it is a capability that God has given us, as evidenced by our ability to do it. And we didn't talk about what the NASA calls spin-offs, but you can justifiably argue that there's been lots of improvement to life on Earth as a direct result of space exploration and the development of technology to support space exploration. And it continues. And NASA tries to take credit for that. Again, it falls under the umbrella of subduing God's creation for our good and for His glory. Now, we all don't give Him glory for that, but that's our view on it. As a believer.
All right, let me throw something out, and I'll get your feedback on this. What if the dominion mandate that God has given to us is everything to which He has committed everything to us that we can exercise dominion over? So, for instance, there would have been a time in which man was not exercising dominion over the whole earth. Mm-hmm. At the time, it would take population, etc., for man to do that. Then we have now, sort of in a way, exercised dominion over the air. Mm-hmm. Now we've achieved space travel, but there are going to be limits to the extent to which we can go into the universe, the limitations being man's own mortality, our own intellectual ability, or the limits of this creation, and the sin, the curse, the law of thermodynamics, etc., keeps us from traveling probably faster than we do and keeps us from being able to go to the furthest. Like, we'll never be able to get to Pluto.
Or live long enough to get there.
Yeah, live long enough to get there at whatever rate we can travel. And there's obviously limits in this creation that are going to limit the speed at which we can travel, because the faster you approach the speed of light, the more mass you have, the heavier you have, the more energy it takes. So there comes a point where it takes an infinite amount of energy to get your spacecraft up to the point where you can actually travel at the speed of light. So all of those limitations are already imposed upon us. We've overcome some of those in exercising dominion, taking control of that. But is the dominion mandate, would it be fair to say the dominion mandate is limited by man's own ability and the confines of this creation as God has ordered it? We can exercise dominion up to the point where we can't anymore. And so that would include space. It might include the moon. It might include Mars, but maybe nothing after that.
You're hired.
Okay. Feel free to use that anywhere you go. All right, worm or globe NASA logo?
Oh, that's reference to the original NASA logo was called the worm, the way it was scripted. And then somewhere along the line, the NASA administrator came along and said, oh, that thing's ugly. Let's go to a more modern look, a modern script, text, and ASA. And then years later, another administrator came in and wanted to go back to the traditional worm. That's what that is. So, yeah, I remember at Ames Research Center in California, they ignored for a long time the mandate of changing it back to the worm. Or no, I think it was getting rid of the worm until the administrator was coming for a visit. And then they went into a panic and they were up on sides of buildings covering up the worm and putting on the new logo.
How have your experiences in space helped you grow in your faith?
How did my experience in space?
How have your experiences in space helped you grow in your faith? Has it helped with patience, for example?
Yeah, one question well, it's rich, and I mean, everything I communicated this weekend was informed in part anyway, certainly by the Word of God, but informed in part by the experience. So it has enriched my faith. Sometimes I get the question, did going to space, my experience in space, change my relationship with God or something like that? And I say no. You know, people are like, how can that be? But it's a great opportunity when you get a question like that. No, it didn't change my relationship with God. We can know of God through His revelation in creation, but we can only know Him through His special revelation found in Jesus Christ. So in that respect, going to space didn't change my relationship with God, but it enriched, enhanced, gave illustration to the truth in His special revelation found in Scripture. And the work of the Spirit that opened my eyes to that truth.
Okay. Yuri Gagarin, first Russian astronaut?
First man in space.
First man in space. He, at one point before going up into space, peed on a bus tire. Was it for good luck? Have you ever done that? That's the question.
It's a very practical thing. It takes an hour to go through the suit up process. And you're, by the way, in front of an audience. Anna Marie was there for every time I suited up in Russia or in Kazakhstan in a Russian suit. And you're behind glass and there's a couple hundred people cramped into this room watching you get suited up. And then you get pressure checks of the suit to make sure there's no leaks. And then there's a kind of a formal march out of that room across the parking lot, and everybody's moved out there, and you walk out there and you're waving to people, and you go and you salute to the head of the Russian Space Agency and say, we're ready for the flight. And then you get on a bus and you take about a 2-mile drive to the launch pad. Well, a lot of time has gone by. So it's just a physical necessity, desire to make one last pit stop before you climb into the rocket, which you're climbing on, strapping in 2.5 hours before launch. And then you're going to launch and go to orbit and get there in less than 9 minutes, but you're still going to stay strapped in for at least a couple more hours, more like 3.5 hours at a minimum. So it's a long time. So it's just a practical necessity. So Yuri apparently said, hey, can you stop the bus halfway out there where there's no people around? You left the crowd back because nobody gets that close to the launch pad, and stop the bus and go take a break by physical necessity, get relieved before strapping in. And so some people say you do it for good luck. It's a tradition established by Uri, but it's still sort of a practical kind of desirement anyway. So yeah, I did that.
How many solar panels and what's the watt output? Are they deep cell or lithium batteries? How many amp hours? And is the space station a 12-volt system?
All right, who's the engineer in here? We started out with nickel cadmium batteries, and they're about this big. And there's, I can't remember the number. I want to say 16, might be more than that. They're a big number, and they're spread out across the truss segment. A few years ago, we upgraded them to, again, big batteries, but made lithium-ion batteries that were developed. I can't remember the kilowatts of the capacity of the space station. I just knew it provided all the power I needed. What was the other?
How many solar panels?
Well, on the picture you saw 8 pairs of wings, and each pair of wings has 2 panels in itself. But 8 power channels. So a lot of power, and the power system is very important, obviously, and very complex. And by the way, the solar panels, they rotate this way once every orbit, so they're always pointing toward the sun, and then they pivot this way. So the sun may be orbiting this way, but the sun's over there, so they're pointed toward the sun, but then twisted to what we call the beta angle. So you're maximizing the angle to the sun. And they point to the sun even when we're on the dark side of the earth, because you just keep the motion going continually. And by definition, they do that. And the batteries discharge when the sun goes down. And then the batteries start charging when we get back in the sunlight.
How far down do the batteries go during that dark period?
It depends upon the power load and several factors. I don't remember the number exactly, but I want to say it varies between, say, I want to say in the order of 30% charge up to 90%, up and down, up and down. And that can be managed too. You can isolate a battery so you don't discharge it if you want to. And the mission control specialists that focus on the power system, they manage all that. We don't do a whole lot with
from
it
down here.
From down here. Mission control in Houston.
Do you believe the medical field is finding solutions to our illnesses from within the order and provision of God?
Absolutely. It's just one example. Yes. We've been given a capacity to search out the order in the medical arena. We live in a fallen world, as I acknowledged, and disease and medical problems come as a consequence of the fall. We die. We're all mortal as a consequence of the fall. But yet in God's grace, He has given us provision in the medical field, which has improved, of course, throughout history. So yes, absolutely.
So we in some way we are exercising dominion over the planet to improve human flourishing, and we can cure diseases, cure illnesses, make life better. But we're never going to. Again, it's within the confines of this creation. We're never going to overcome the death problem.
Right.
More proof of what I just taught you here a few minutes ago.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, on the space station, what are some of the responsibilities of the crew members, and also what kind of research and studies are done from the space station?
Well, we're all generalists, so most of us can be assigned to do any of the kind of work at any given day. There's some exceptions. Not everybody does spacewalks. We always have at least 2 of the Russians and 2 of the rest of the crew trained for respective spacewalk systems, because the Russians have their own system, we have a system. In the early days, we trained on both sides, but when the crew grew to a crew of 6, then we no longer spent all that time investing in a lot of detailed training on the other side, if you will. But you get trained to operate the space station, get trained to repair the space station, to maintain it, and that's a lot of electrical, plumbing, all the other utility work you might imagine. Not everybody gets medical training, but I would say most of the crew ends up with medical training. It's a laboratory, so I've done hundreds of experiments. I don't even remember the number, but the experiments can be across all the disciplines of science. You can do material science, biology, either plants or critters. We have, in recent years, mice on board doing medical-related experiments the same way that medical research hospitals will have mice rodent experiments to support we're guinea pigs ourselves, so we're subjects for lots of medical experiments.
Your medical data is recorded?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Limited, whatever the objective of an experiment is and what we consent to, we'll participate. And I generally consented to almost everything. I thought it was stewarding the opportunity to be responsible, make myself available to learn what could be learned. So those were probably the most annoying things you go through, but also the most interesting, some of the medical experiments. We can do it quite a bit on board. I was drawing blood all the time, my own and others. We have an ultrasound on board, so we did a lot of ultrasound studies and other studies as well. And we in recent years we've been focused on the eye because about almost half of the population suffers one degree or another of a loss of visual acuity, and we don't understand the root cause of that. Some think it might be indirectly related to weightlessness. Some think it's related to breathing and living in a higher level of CO2 over a long period of time. Maybe diet contributes to it. So we've been trying to study to isolate what's causing that. We're still don't know what it is, but we have done a lot of medical experiments to research that. So those are just some examples, I guess.
You mentioned to me privately elsewhere about the bone mass, bone density.
Yes. If people ask what are the effects of going to space, and you realize the effects, especially when you return to Earth and the relentless force of gravity that I talked about. If we know that if we don't exercise up there, not only will our muscles atrophy and get weaker because we're not even supporting our body weight up there. Even now we're all sitting down, but we're supporting ourselves. So some muscles are being used in that support. In weightlessness, you don't have any necessity to use the muscles. They would atrophy, but our bones also would atrophy if you don't exercise, particularly with a heavy loading, like heavy deadlifts and body squats are two primary exercises. So we've, over the years, developed exercise equipment to effectively be able to load up our bodies with high weights. You're not carrying your body weight, so you have to subtract out the body weight, but I was easily working up to doing a squat of 350 pounds on this machine we called the resistive exercise device. We didn't have that on board for my first 6-month flight in 2006. And when I came back from that, I had and we do lots of medical testing on the ground too, so they knew my overall calcium density, for example, in my bones. And I had a significant loss of calcium density after that flight, which took about 1.5 to 2 years to recover from, because your bones atrophy. Our bones are continually turning over. They're continually tearing down and rebuilding. Tearing down, there's two processes that occur in parallel. And the rebuilding of the bone is stimulated in part by exercise. So if you don't exercise, the tearing down of bone accelerates greater than the rebuilding of bone. But the new exercise equipment that we got after that flight was very effective. I had no measurable bone loss. It also does a very good job of maintaining muscle mass, although you can't isolate every muscle in your body in weightlessness, even with the effective exercise equipment. For example, your small bones that stabilize your spine are not used for the heavy lifting. They're just used, we take it for granted, they're just used to stabilize our spine, and they're not exercised on orbit. So that's one example of why it takes so long to recover from spaceflight. And that takes about 6 weeks or so, working with a trainer almost every day. We take weekends off after the first couple of weeks, but start out every day working with a trainer with a very disciplined program to regain muscle strength, flexibility, and coordination. Related to the coordination is your vestibular system, our sense of balance. I think I talked about it
did that
last night. So that takes about 10 days or so to recover from.
Do astronauts have top secret clearance for any experiments or activities done in space?
No, there was a time, not for that. We might have a clearance for other purposes, just operational purposes. But generally, it's an open system, open program. It's all public domain. So,
are any experiments done in the space station kept private from astronauts from other countries?
We did not protect, with very limited, it was very limited what we would not, well, how do I want to say this? It would not be exposed to some of the crew members, but that was very limited. Most things were open to everybody on the crew. I can't even think of a specific example, but it seems to me if I thought a little bit harder, I would come up with something. It wasn't that significant. It was just something that was a little bit more sensitive.
Did each country have its own lab up there, or do you all work out of the common lab?
The Russian segment of the space station is largely separate from what we call the U.S. segment, and the U.S. segment is shared by the European laboratory as well as the Japanese laboratory. And the Canadian contribution is a robotic arm. So in terms of operations, the Russians later when the crew size grew to 6, as I said, the Russians largely concentrated in their segment, and they had enough work to keep them busy, so it wasn't practical to come over, although they did come over, participate in some things, just like we occasionally participated in some things on their side. In my first flight, though, my first long flight, 6-month flight, and even into the second flight, I was trained on all the Russian systems as well and participated in a lot of activities there because we were only a crew of 2 or 3, and they needed us for all the work areas on space station.
What was your biggest mistake done in space?
There were so many of them. Everybody makes mistakes. I think the one I felt most bad about was I did an experiment for the Japanese one time, and it was a nematode experiment. So nematodes are microscopic worms, and we birthed. It was timed. They were launched and came to us, and these nematodes were birthed in this fluid, timed right after they arrived on space station. And half of the lot I put into a centrifuge, and they ran in a centrifuge, as I recall, for a few days, and the other was just in an incubator, stayed in weightlessness. So the centrifuge gave them a little bit of a kind of an artificial gravity, although the nematodes probably got very dizzy. And then the others were in complete weightlessness. And then after that period of time, we took them out, put them under the microscope, and I was zooming the image down to the ground to the scientists, and there was a big difference between the two. The ones in weightlessness were very lethargic and didn't look healthy, and the ones under gravity were more normal. But then there was a little detail in the procedure that I missed, that I was supposed to put them in the freezer when the whole operation was done to be preserved for later return to the ground. And I left them Velcroed to the wall overnight. And that, of course, ruined the experiment for them. I felt bad about that.
Did you hear the music of the spheres? I think that's from the hymn, This Is Our Father's World. Right? Did you hear the music of the spheres? Or what does space sound like? Can you hear it?
Well, space requires a medium to travel through. So technically...
Sound. You mean sound requires a medium to travel through.
Yeah. What did I say? Space. Yeah. Sound requires a medium to travel to, and in the vacuum of space, there's no medium. So you don't hear something unless it can travel through something. And of course, inside a spacesuit, during a spacewalk, all you hear is the fan inside the suit circulating in the air. Now, if you bang into something, the helmet hits structure of the space station, or even if your crewmates came and slapped you on the head, you'd hear that because it's transmitted through the structure of the helmet and then through the oxygen that is surrounding your head. So you can hear that, but you wouldn't hear something happening out there because there's no medium to translate.
Were there other believers in the space station with you?
Yeah, on occasion. Among Americans. Only Americans.
A lot?
I would say historically maybe 4. That includes Barry Wilmore, who on his first flight, who was one of them supposedly stranded in orbit. He's a good friend. He's an elder in his church. On his first flight, which was a short space shuttle flight, on that flight they came and docked to the space station. So we overlapped about the week of his stay on space station. Yeah.
How does space weather, coronal mass ejections, or high solar wind affect the space station?
Only in that if they predict that the radiation level will get above a certain threshold, and we have specialists on the ground that monitor all that. On occasion, and I don't remember ever it happening when I was on board, but on occasion they would have the crew go to a safe haven location of the space station where the protection from the radiation outside was maximized. At least it was thought to be maximized for a period of time. That would be the only impact, perhaps.
What are the risks of using pure oxygen in a spacesuit? How are they mitigated? Give us some examples.
Yeah, they're mitigated in a couple ways. One, the design of the spacesuit, flammable material is very limited in its use because you need it, and also the electrical systems and related, which could be a potential ignition source, are designed in a way to mitigate that risk, so you have no risk. In fact, that's what caused the Apollo 1 fire, was 100% oxygen under high pressure, and there was an electrical short that sparked it, and it went up very quickly. It's explosive in 100% oxygen. But the other way that the risk is mitigated in a spacesuit, as I mentioned this too, we go down to a low pressure, 4.3 pounds per square inch, which, by the way, is the partial pressure of oxygen that we're all breathing right now. So at the lower pressure, it's less flammable, less risky. So it's managed in all those ways.
Is alcohol allowed on the space station? And if not, what do the Russians think about this?
Well, you'll have to ask them what they think about it, but no, it's not allowed.
Knowing what you know now, how would you counsel young men faced with the option of military service?
If I would examine them, and I do examine them a little bit, to try to get them to determine whether they're being called to serve. And of course, that's not always easy to discern, but I think it's an honorable thing to do, but you have to be called to that vocation, called to serve the country for the right reasons. Not everybody is built for it. So you don't want to be doing it for the wrong reasons. But obviously I would think it's a legitimate calling in life.
All right, I get this question twice, so I'll ask the more detailed one. How do you recommend that we address the problems associated with funding science out of a deficit spending as a government? In other words, this ties into, should space travel and exploration be publicly funded or privately funded?
Well, it should be both. It's an investment. Research is an investment for corporations as well. It's an easy thing to cut, and often it gets cut because for short-term gain at the expense of long-term payback. The same tendency can happen in the government, although I think a primary role of government can include basic research because the government has the resources to do it. It's a very small percentage of the overall budget, so it's not going to even impact, you can cut it up, but it's not going to be for deficit reduction or even to improve some other program. It just doesn't happen that way.
Which is wasting so much money on other garbage stuff.
Yes, it's in the noise. So I think it's, in most cases, not always, because you can argue about what kind of research you're going to do, what you're going to dedicate it to, but in principle, in general, it's an appropriate investment made in the future. And actually, if you look at the fruits that have come out of legitimate science and research and whatnot, it has improved life in ways that are significant that we often take for granted, and in effect improved those areas of, feeding the poor and all of that, and addressing those kinds of social issues. And combine that with, it is a fallen world. You can dedicate resources to feed the hungry, for example, and those that are hungry never receive it, just because of the systems of the world and whatnot. And we read about that, for example, in Gaza all the time. That you can feel good by sending all this aid there, but the aid never receives those that need it. It's squandered and hijacked along the way.
Is for-profit space industry like lunar and asteroid mining viable?
Hypothetically, it is. I think we're a long way from making it profitable in terms of a business model. But the same could be said in history about other things that are now profitable. So presumably it could be.
Will we ever see people living and working in space in any long-term or large-scale sense?
I don't think large scale. I touched on this before. I think everything we need for our habitation is found here on Earth. So anything we do off the planet has to be supplied from the planet, and we have to duplicate all of the things that God has designed into what makes it habitable, and we have to resupply from the Earth. So I can't imagine even the rationale for doing that at large scale.
Is there a common voltage used for tools and other equipment on the space station?
Yeah, we've migrated it. Actually, we're using more off-the-shelf tools, especially electric drills, that kind of thing. Let's see, the Russians have a 28-volt system. We actually have a 120-volt DC system, but then we scope it down and we have AC inverters for different applications. So we use a variety of motors.
China was successful in landing instrumentation on the dark side of the moon. How does it communicate with Earth without a direct line of sight?
They did not land on the dark side of the moon. Occasionally, think about it, the dark side of the moon we see. It's on our side. So the dark side of the moon changes all the time. What they did do is they landed on the far side of the moon, which is often lit.
Okay.
Just to pick on the question a little bit. So what was the question again?
Okay. Now that we've clarified that, China was successful in landing instrumentation on the far side of the moon. How does it communicate with Earth without a direct line of sight, or does it have a direct line of sight?
Actually, I don't know. I don't know what they have done. I remember reading that headline that they done it, and I haven't paid attention since.
Okay. With a 90-minute day-night cycle, do you ever get jet lag? And how does the experience help or hinder jet lag on Earth since you came back?
We work on a Greenwich Mean Time, so we work on the clock. We work on a 24-hour day. So we'll wake up at 6 a.m. Typically, a typical day is 6 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the time in Greenwich, England, and then go to bed about 10 o'clock is the scheduled time. So because we're on that 24-hour cycle, we adjust to that time zone after we dock, because we've typically gone from Moscow time to Greenwich Mean Time, which is just a couple hours change, but we adjust to that. Occasionally we'll do a big shift on orbit to accommodate either special requirements for a spacewalk, which we would have to do effectively in our nighttime or our sleep time, or be awake to receive a docking of a cargo ship, for example, or another crew arriving or departing or whatnot. And it's just like adapting to time shift if you fly to Europe or whatever.
Do you share bunk with somebody?
No, we each have private crew quarters. In principle, in general, it's a size of a old phone booth, which don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
But it's a place that you can close the door and it's dark, so you don't have all the other lights on all the time, and it cuts down the noise a little bit, and it's a little bit private.
Is there ever a time when everybody on the space station is asleep, or do you have watches that go all night?
No, we do not have watches. Everybody's sleep time is generally, occasionally split, but generally it's the same.
Okay.
And we got mission control centers, primarily Moscow and Houston, looking over our shoulder continually.
Have you ever had a cold or flu on the International Space Station, and what was it like? If yes, does your nose always run with no gravity?
Well, your nose runs. It's difficult to it doesn't follow the course of gravity, but it certainly lines your nostrils. Let's see, cold or flu. I don't remember having a cold or flu. You do have the effects of being in weightlessness, which I call it kind of a head stuffiness feeling, and that's almost continuous. There has been the flu bug that was carried to the space station crew, which was a miserable time for them, but it never while I was on board. And I think it was attributed, at least in the time I remember, to maybe one of the space shuttle crew members' children, the isolation from children, which is the hardest thing to do when you're a parent getting ready to launch. But kids carry bugs, right? We know that if we ever put them in Sunday school or daycare or whatnot, they carry it home. So that was a miserable time for the crew to go through. You can imagine all that in weightlessness. Maybe you can't. But
do you ever get scared?
No, it's not an inventory of feelings. You certainly have moments of, you're focused and you're responding as trained to certain circumstances. There was once we had Pavel Vinogradov and we had Thomas Reiter, a German astronaut that had joined us, and he had a piece of equipment overheat, malfunction internally, began smoking, and we declared a fire emergency. But we just did as we're trained, and we trained for that kind of stuff all the time, responded to it, and neutralized the situation very quickly, working with mission control centers to get the power off the piece of equipment. It stopped the overheating. It stopped the smoking. And then we have procedures to clean up the atmosphere, which is the other thing we're worried about. And we were able to do that pretty efficiently. So that was one example. But you just respond and do as you're trained.
What makes the aurora?
The aurora is the interaction between the radiation that comes from deep space, primarily the sun, which varies and can be predicted, and the magnetic field, and then the ionosphere, I think, as I recall, that charged particles that are charged, and there's a response that generates light from the interaction between the radiation come from the sun and the magnetic field.
Is there an age limit to go to space?
No, I flew my last two flights. I was over 50. I never thought I'd fly over 50, and we seem to be extending the age. Don Pettit flew just recently over. He's set. I think he turned 70 on orbit. He and I were in the same class, 96 class. He's the stereotype mad scientist. He worked at Los Alamitos, which is where they developed the atomic bomb. He's a physicist. He's a science geek. He's the stereotype science geek, and he just won't leave. And they gave him another opportunity to fly. He's a great guy.
How did you get into NASA?
I set it as a goal when I was a cadet at West Point, inspired by some of my mentors there at West Point. I decided I wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to advance my education in engineering, become an experimental test pilot, and eventually get to NASA. And in God's providence, it all worked out that way. But I set it as a goal about the age of 19, 20 or so, and then started, graduated in 1980, went right to flight school, went to West Germany, flew an operational assignment there, came back, got an opportunity to go to graduate school to get a master's degree in engineering, started applying to NASA in 1985. Challenger accident happened in 86. They picked up the selection process in 87. I interviewed for the first time. It went well. Interview was a week long down there. They interview 110 people in those days for a given class out of thousands of applicants. So it was a big deal just to get an interview.
How many thousands?
I want to say 5,000 or 6,000 in those days. It peaked out in the 2000 teens, maybe early teens, at 18,000 applicants. And that year, I think we picked 10. So it was a big deal to get an interview. Out of the interview, I got the phone call, sorry, we didn't select you, but we'd like you to come here to work. Would you be willing? So it was an offer I couldn't refuse. we went to Houston in 80. At the time, I gave my testimony, right? We were moving to Houston for the first time. The next selection was in 1990. I waited patiently to get the call for an interview, and I didn't get called. And had no idea why. It turned out to be kind of a administrative error, they said. They gave me good feedback. We screwed up. The process screwed up. So that motivated me to stay there, not go back to the Army. So we stayed for another 2 years. 92, I interviewed again and got medically disqualified.
Mental illness?
Yeah. It was a technicality, and the doctors tried to argue for that I was good, but it was the lawyers among them said, no, we're not going to entertain an appeal. I'll tell you what it was. It was a antibody level of my thyroid, produced by my thyroid, that they found in a blood sample. I still have a healthy thyroid to this day. So, and they had a lot of constraints, I would say over-constrained, because they were starting to tighten up the medical qualifications, anticipating space station long-duration flights. So that one got me. I became medically disqualified in 92. So we left. I went back to an Army assignment, and God's providence and His grace gave me an opportunity to realize becoming an experimental test pilot, serving as a test pilot for a couple of years at Edwards Air Force Base in California. In 95, the next selection comes along. I'm still medically disqualified, so they couldn't even call me. In 96, they had scrubbed the medical requirements, scrubbed that out as a qualifying requirement. I interviewed in 96, got selected.
So how many times is that you attempted and applied?
10 years, 6 applications, 3 interviews. And I tell that story, I can't remember if I did it Q&A last night, but I tell that story to young people especially, to not be discouraged so much that you quit trying to achieve a goal the first time you fail to achieve it, but a lesson in perseverance and continuing to do as the Lord calls you, and continuing to serve in the duties that you're given.
Does the soft landing ever start a grass fire?
It has in the past. I don't think we had anything serious in my 3 landings, but I know of at least a couple where a significant grass fire was started. Didn't hurt the crew, didn't damage the spacecraft. It burns pretty quickly and spreads out and gets away, and then in all cases, it eventually was extinguished on its own.
In eternity, on the new heavens and the new earth, do you think we will desire to explore space? And will that be your chance to go to Mars?
I don't think there'll be any desire to go to Mars. I think we'll want to keep our presence in the New Jerusalem. Yeah.
The Randy Alcorn in his book Heaven, for those of you who haven't read, how many have read that book here, by the way? Okay, that's very good. Randy Alcorn in his book Heaven speculates, sanctified speculation, that in the new heavens and the new earth, that our dominion will extend beyond this present earth, that we will be able to enjoy God's presence at any place in the universe, since it will all testify to His glory, and that the desire that we have to press out from where we are at, we will have that in the new creation, and we will be able to explore space beyond our ability to do so here. And of course, to go back to my brilliant observation from earlier, if indeed we are in a different creation with different limitations, the limitations of death and danger and time would not apply in the new creation, and therefore the extent of the dominion mandate that we could have would be greater than it is in this creation. That's where that comes from. I'll go to Mars. I'll sign up for that in the new creation. From the
Anna Marie won't let me go to Mars.
From the perspective of space, let me go back for a second to that observation about the new heavens and the new earth. Because when I read this question, I was going to bring this up, remind you of this. In the prophets, I think it's in Isaiah says that that the dominion of that His dominion, that is speaking of Christ, His dominion will be an everlasting dominion, and there will be no increase to His kingdom or to the expanse of His rule. One of the marks of a monarch is that they are always bringing either people or territory under their dominion with an ever-increasing, and that's how Isaiah describes Jesus as being one who will someday possess everything, and yet there will always be an expansion to what He possesses, an ever-increasing kingdom. And, of course, the sanctified speculation is that in the new heavens and the new earth, he will have an ongoing creative process of developing things for us to explore and to do. So there will always be an element of his kingdom that is getting bigger and expanding, and we get the delight and the joy of exercising dominion over that ever-expanding kingdom to the glory of our King. So, from the perspective of space, what have you observed regarding glacier activity decreasing or increasing?
I think it's fair to say I've seen evidence of both seasonally and then over a period of years. But again, my exposure has been relatively very short time. I will admit that Kilimanjaro was decreasing over the years. I think that's well documented. But I don't draw any conclusions like we would read in the media.
How do we know what to use to make it safe for astronauts to go past our atmosphere, like spacesuits and rockets? I guess the idea of the question there is, whoever asked that question, I'll clarify that. How do we know what to use to make it safe for astronauts?
Well, we know what's required to sustain life, and we do an assessment so we know what the risks to life are and the means required to get there. Riding on a rocket, for example, leaving the atmosphere, we need a life support system. The integrity of the spacecraft needs to protect the crew inside with a functioning life support system that gives the performance required to, for example, support the number of crew members that are on the rocket. So if you have a crew of 3, you require less performance than if you have a crew of 6 or 7 in terms of providing oxygen, removing carbon dioxide that we exhale with every breath, removing the humidity. We also need not only performance, but we need reliability. We need it to be assured that it's going to work. And if we recognize that something's going to fail, there's a chance it will fail, we need a second system or maybe a third system to add redundancy so that when that one system fails, the other 1 or 2 systems pick up the load while we repair the first system. So then if we need repair capability, then we take spare parts and procedures and design it to be repairable. So those are just some examples. That's getting there, that's staying there, that's whatever job we're going to do there, we design it for all of that. And then when we return, I described entry before. It's a pretty dynamic ride through 3,000 degrees or more outside, caused by the friction of the speed coming through the atmosphere. So you have to have thermal protection systems. I mean, when we land in a Soyuz, I described as if going through a car wreck, crashing in the ground, hitting the ground under the parachute. I didn't mention, I don't think, that you're also drenched in sweat because it's hot, it's humid. The system of the Soyuz, after undocking from the space station, is designed to get you safely back to the Earth, but it's limited in its design. So you don't stay nice and cool and comfortable during the higher. You end up, because of the heat loading outside and just because of the metabolic processes of the human body, the heat load increases. Not excessively, and it's certainly operational. It's adequate. But you're not going to go much beyond that so you don't have to. So all of those things, all of those aspects, and they're all thought through in great detail when we design a system to perform an operation like that.
What is the water system on the space station? You obviously have a limited amount of that. How do you use and reuse water?
In the early days when the shuttle was flying, the space shuttle had an electrical generation system that was called a fuel cell, and there were 3 of them, and they were each fed by liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. And those were fed into the fuel cell, and the product was electricity, which powered all the systems. The byproduct was water, pure water. And that water was transferred to the space station whenever the shuttle was docked to the space station. So we accumulated a lot of water. And then other water was delivered in tanks by the Russians or other supply ships. And then later in the life of the space station, we added new technology, and the space station is used in part for technology development, in this case in the form of water recycling equipment. So since then, and we installed that in about 2008 or 9, I think. 2009. And it was new technology, and it's been adjusted since then, maybe a design tweaks or whatnot, component change outs as we learned how to operate it. But nowadays we get well over a 90% efficiency of recycling of water. We collect the humidity, the condensate that is collected and put through recycling to make potable water. And we also recycle 90-some% of the urine and get the water out of the urine. So Don Pettit, who I mentioned earlier, the mad scientist who's turned 70 on orbit, he used to say, I'll quote him, "We turn yesterday's coffee into tomorrow's coffee."
Is the suit comfortable?
No. The spacesuit to do spacewalks? No, and bottom line is no, it's not comfortable, but it's fit as best as it can be and to the point of being very workable and tolerable.
Do you ever get untethered?
No, you don't want to become famous by messing up and getting untethered.
How long have you been a sleeper agent for the KGB?
My first trip to Russia was in 1998 or 1999. So I guess that long, yes. And actually, it's not the KGB, it's the FSB. After the Soviet Union fell, they changed the acronym. Same function, though. We always knew who the FSB agent was in our midst, on the team. And they're not only watching us, they're watching the Russians. That's the way the system is governed historically. The secret police were started even in the time of the czars before the Russian Revolution. We can't, in our experience, we can't comprehend it. So we have this, I would say, a little bit arrogant attitude that when the Soviet Union fell, we're going to engage with this new Russia, and they're going to welcome our system of democracy, and we're going to help them build the system of democracy. Well, it takes a whole lot more than that. They don't have that in their culture, in their history. It's governed, very challenging country to govern, and they've done it through a secret police force. So they inherently, historically, don't trust each other unless they have very tight personal relationships over a period of time. And you still don't talk publicly about things unless you're in the privacy of your home. And in the Soviet times, you even assumed that you were being bugged, especially among believers. We live in an immigrant community now, and the older generation immigrated from the Soviet Union, where they were a persecuted bunch of Russian Baptists. Less than 1% of the population. So they were a minority in terms of numbers, and they were highly persecuted. Our pastor's father, who we knew well, he passed away in 2020, actually from COVID, was imprisoned for 3 years for his faith. And he spent his adult life in the Soviet times being chased by the KGB because he was a church leader. He was one of the young men leading and ministering to different home churches around a vast area. So he was always on the run. Alexei grew up with as a young boy with his father in prison for years, or gone in ministry on the run from the KGB. So it's a different culture that it's foreign to most of us. But deep faith as a result. It's very encouraging to be in ministry with them. Given that history. The church is always strongest in persecution throughout history. And we tend to have a life of comfort. And our tendency, I know it's not true here, but the tendency of the church is to become weak in times of comfort. So there's a blessing in the hard times when we grow in our understanding of our utter dependency upon the provision of God, ultimately found in redemption.
Were you, during your time in Russia, were you ever monitored, surveilled?
Oh, I know I was. I didn't really pay a lot of attention to it. I just assumed I was. And I made myself as boring as I could, so eventually they'd lose interest.
You and I were talking earlier. One of the other questions. What does astronaut ice cream taste like on the space station?
I have no idea. I've never had it. They only sell it to tourists and gift shops.
You and I were talking earlier about a moon space station. You talked about the goal being to go back to the moon, or to the moon, depending on your perspective. I'll say back to the moon. The process of doing that, would we go to the space station, launch from there to the moon, and make trips back and forth from the space station? Or would we have to create another space station to accomplish that?
The intent has all those elements. Now, the sequence that we actually realize in the future, because it's spread out over so many years, because of the level of funding dedicated to it, which is relatively low. I don't know exactly how it'll turn out, but there's we already have done one unmanned test flight of the rocket, the SLS, as I mentioned, and the Orion spacecraft, which will take a crew to the vicinity of the moon. Then they need a lunar lander to go down to the surface of the moon. The plan is, the big picture is to develop that capability and then to launch mostly unmanned rockets with components of space station, and build a smaller space station, smaller than the ISS, which will be in a kind of an odd orbit around the moon. So if I'm the sun in the moon, or if I'm the Earth and the moon is here, the space station will be orbiting in an oblong orbit in this direction. So the orbital plane will be perpendicular to the line between Earth and the moon. So it'll always be visible from the Earth. The vision is then for the crew to go and dock with that space station, and then in another docking port have a lunar lander and go down from that space station to the surface of the moon, execute the mission objectives on the surface of the moon, then return to the station, and then get in that Orion spacecraft and come back to Earth.
Are they envisioning a continual human presence there in that space station?
No. There will be, the best case is one mission a year, and on the order of a couple, 3 weeks, or several weeks, plus or minus, duration of mission, which is a very low rate. It'll be very hard to sustain that because it's stretched out over so much time. I talked earlier about political will. I think that's one of the biggest risks of a program built like that, is sustaining the will to keep it going.
Is it possible to build a type of a space station on the surface of the moon that would be, you would go there, land, and use that as a base of operations?
There's a concept, different design concepts for a habitat on the surface of the moon. Whether that actually comes to realization, I think, is TBD. For the practical reason of, there's lots of different places to land on the moon, obviously. And currently the primary objective is to go to the south pole of the moon, because the orbital satellites around the moon now that have done surveys with different instruments have suggested the data shows the likelihood of large quantities of frozen water under the surface of the South Pole, because it doesn't get direct sunlight. And water is a resource that has a lot of potential for use, not only for life support, for water itself, but for oxygen and hydrogen, for both life support, the oxygen, as well as fuel, potential fuel, producing fuel from the resources. And whatever resources you can mine on the moon, of course, that saves having to launch it and supply it from Earth. So the South Pole is the primary target planned for now. That's what all the planning, all the research is focused on. But that doesn't mean we want to go back there. We don't know until we get the results, what we find there, whether we want to go back there or go somewhere else. So you can envision a habitat there, but then you take the risk of, okay, we change the priorities. We're not going to go back to the location. We're going to another location, and then you wouldn't have the habitat. So we'll see.
There might be more exploration before they settle down in any one location.
Yeah, and again, it's over a long period of time, years.
Is it feasible to go from the space station, the current International Space Station, to the moon and back?
No. In low Earth orbit, it's hard to imagine, I suppose, but we're still in what we call the gravity well of Earth. And it takes a lot of energy that's not practical to get out of that low Earth orbit of 250 miles above the Earth to escape the gravity well of Earth and get to the moon. So it's just not practical. It's more practical to start at the surface of the Earth on a rocket that will get you the energy to escape Earth's gravity and get to the moon. And by the way, it's kind of a slingshot. So you want to throw the rocket away from Earth's gravity just to escape and then be captured by the gravity of the moon. So as you get farther away from Earth, its force diminishes and eventually you're picked up by the force of the moon. And then it accelerates you toward the moon at a predictable rate, so that then you fire the engine when you get there. And you don't go directly to the moon, you go to just the side of the moon to get captured into that orbit using your propulsion system. But that's the most efficient way to do it energy-wise.
And how about coming back? You're not stopping at the space station on the way back.
No, it would take the same magnitude of energy, not very impractical, to enter the orbit that would enable you to rendezvous and dock with the space station. So instead you target, say if you got the globe of the Earth, you're targeting right at the edge of that, at the edge of the atmosphere, so that you come in at a predictable speed, but it's a very high speed. So you hit the atmosphere not too high and skip off and end up doing a big elliptical orbit way far away on the other side of the Earth, and not too steep into the atmosphere because the G loading would be excessive and the spacecraft or the crew may not survive, but just at the right angle so that the drag of the atmosphere captures you, and you get through the entry into a condition where the parachute opening will succeed. It's physics, very predictable, very measurable, operates under the laws of the lawgiver.
Yep.
Imposed on creation.
That was our last question. Do you have anything else you want to share?
No, other than just thank you for your interest in this. As I said before, I think this is very important. Obviously, space draws a high level of interest generally in the public. People are fascinated with it because we bear the image of the Creator and we have this curiosity, right? So if you can't do it personally, you have the curiosity vicariously. You want to know what it's like. So I appreciate that, but it's explained by the biblical worldview that we've been talking to. And that's, I talked about the Science Center envisioned. That's family center, science-themed family center. That's one of the primary motivations to do it, because it draws people in. We have this curiosity. So I trust that this experience of last night and today will help stimulate your delight in the studied works of God.
All right. Thank you for coming, your time, your effort, and we appreciate it. Let's give him a round of applause and thank Colonel Williams. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the latest podcast from Kootenai Church. If you'd like to learn more about Kootenai Church or to donate to our church ministry, you can do so online by visiting kootenaichurch.org. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and pray you'll join us again next time. Once again, thank you for listening.